Okay, this is a little segment on page 91. Mark Ritchie was a policy analyst at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Oh, before I do that, I have to go in and say, this was in 82, and I'd come back to North Dakota, and I had encountered many absolutely broke farmers. And I had no idea what I was doing, and somehow I heard about Mark. So I met Mark, and this is about when we met. So Mark Ritchie was a policy analyst at the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. I believe he had a room in the sub-basement. And a farm organizer who modeled his work on the old-timers of the 1930s, like William Langer, Usher Burdick, and the Farmers Holiday Association. The first time I ever went to Mark's house in St. Paul, he introduced me to a special guest, 90-year-old Clarence Sharp, a progressive activist who'd worked under A.C. Townley, founder of the Nonpartisan League before joining the Communist Party in the 1930s and leading penny auctions against farm foreclosures in South Dakota. And I have to do another aside here, because like in 1988, when I ran for Commissioner of Agriculture, I was going all over North Dakota, and wherever I went, there would usually be some pretty old guys coming up with the brightest eyes. And they were all old organizers. And they were getting old by 1988, but they were still there. And they had the brightest eyes. And they would all look at me and they'd say, Vogel, are you related to Frank, who was my grandfather? And if I said yes, they'd go, yeah, okay. You know. And then I think they would vote for me. Okay. Clarence remembered my grandfather Frank well. He knew everybody, he said. He could always get a crowd, even on short notice. And I think when they pulled together a crowd, it was for some really urgent political purpose, or to stop foreclosures and stuff. Mark Ritchie started organizing meetings to bring organizers from Clarence's era and younger farm advocates together to map strategy, share information, and lend support. I didn't have anyone to talk to in North Dakota other than my clients, who just didn't have the big picture. They were trying to feed their animals and children and keep the electricity on. The folks at Mark's meetings saw the big picture, and they could inspire and educate many hundreds of others. They came from Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and Illinois. Over coffee and caramel rolls at a meeting in Minnesota, I met Annette Higby and Jean Severance from the Center for Rural Affairs, who are working on a plain language guide for farmers on FMHA programs and remedies. And when that plain language guide came out, it was life-changing, because suddenly farmers could understand it. Even the lawyers back then, I mean, this is all before internet research. Like in North Dakota, there are two sources for the Dakota federal regulations. One was in Bismarck in the Supreme Court Library, the other was in Grand Forks. That was it. So if you were an attorney in Mulhall, for example, you couldn't help those farmers. The libraries were not there. So when the plain language guide came, even farmers could figure it out, and they could educate the lawyers. I met Dave Ostendorf. Stand up, Dave. And Danny Levitas, who are working at the Midwestern Office of Rural America, a liberal rural advocacy group in Iowa. It later became Prairie Fire. Dave was a United Church of Christ minister and a skilled organizer. Danny was Dave's intern and the youngest among us, though we soon realized he was the sharpest tack in the box. And I talked to Danny recently, and he's down in Georgia practicing law, working for workers, injured workers. He'd grown up in New York City, the son of an editor of the New York Times, and had amazing writing and speaking skills. He'd rebelled as a teenager by leaving New York City and attending the School of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan. After college, he moved to rural Iowa to intern at an organic dairy farm, Dixon Terry's, and to work as an organizer with Rural America and the Progressive Prairie Alliance. These rural organizations drew inspiration from the NPL and the Farmers Holiday Association, and they showed the movie Northern Lights, a 1978 film dramatizing the origins of the NPL at many of their meetings. The meetings of a ragtag group of farm advocates moved around from state to state. I was the only North Dakotan who attended, and I could afford only the time and gas money to go to Minnesota, not to the other states. The 6-hour drive from Bismarck to St. Paul was a long and lonely one, and sometimes I'd mentally rehearse my farewell speech, which went something like, I'm worn out, broke, and tired. I don't have a salary. I have a little kid who needs a roof over his head. I can't do it anymore. I'm here because I thought I owed it to you to tell you in person. I quit several times.
Not for long.
But by the end of the meeting, Mark or Danny or Dave would have helped me see a light at the end of the tunnel. I have learned about some accomplishment in Iowa or been informed of a hearing at which members of Congress excoriated Secretary Block. We fancied ourselves a movement like the Civil Rights Movement or the fight for women's suffrage, and we were. When I left those meetings, I felt inspired, renewed, and hopeful. The small group of people Mark brought together were like slender fibers woven together into a strong rope. A particular fiber separated from the others can easily be snapped, but when all of the fibers are united, woven back and forth and working together, they are impervious to snapping. The young advocates, the young activists were scattered in small Midwestern towns all over, but woven together, we were a force to be reckoned with. So, take it away, Mark.
I think for some in the room, the parts of Sarah's story that intersect with our story has the pain or the desperation. Sarah just kind of laid it out there, but it had the hope and the optimism, but also the notion of a movement, but also the notion of standing on people's shoulders. And none of us really knew that Sarah's dad had been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or that her grandpa had been there when they were making Prairie Fire. And I mean, so when we found this out, we go, oh. But we also didn't know the Sarah that was out in a Fortune 500 being a corporate counsel on the East Coast making good money, who got a phone call from a friend from high school saying, help, something's not right, but more important, I'm about to lose everything. And she just packed up and came out here. And so these parts of Sarah, standing on the shoulders of movements and family and values passed down, and the Sarah of the heart that would not quit or just quit for a little bit and hasn't quit yet. I believe it's fair to say that, well, Sarah's written 4 books and her main identification in her Wikipedia is author, but nobody has stopped and written this story. And Sarah did it while doing everything else that she does. And so you've got somebody here tonight who, even though she's a real North Dakotan, and we occasionally discuss that matter, and there's only so much that can be done. I mean, you can go stay at her house. It's a big house. You know, up there in North Dakota, it's easy to have a big house. But we had a movement. And we sit here tonight, a few of us, remembering what happened to Dixon, who got hit by lightning out baling hay with his 10-year-old son. Ripped the heart out of a movement. And about 10 days later, Tom Saunders got hit by a falling tree out cutting trees with the horses and his 10-year-old son. And maybe 2 weeks later, Darrell Ringer turned the tractor over and killed him out in Kansas. And so the movement suffered the kind of shocks, the shocks that sometimes had come from assassinations, the shocks that sometimes come from just things that happen, but the movement suffered the shocks. But Sarah was a weaver of people, but also she was a lawyer's lawyer. So the closest I get to this is that I had the good sense to marry a lawyer, but I know what it took because I got to kind of watch Sarah mobilize lawyers from all over. We haven't talked about Riesman, there's just a lot of people in this. But what Sarah did was build a case like you would on IBM's monopoly, a case like you would on Brown versus Board of Education. And over the course of almost 30 years, creating the possibility that the law, as written, could then stand on the side, and not just all North Dakota farmers, but kind of farmers everywhere, and black farmers and Native American farmers and all kinds. And so the people of the nation don't know much about the movement, but some folks like Farm Aid and Willie Nelson and Carolyn's here and Glenda's here have kept that alive. But Sarah's done something for our kids and grandkids and for those that really come after us, is to make part of the record down on paper, down on print, so that then we can have a conversation that gives the next generation what we had from Sarah's grandpa and from many others in that moment. We're in a new kind of political moment now. It's a different kind of moment now, but it's the same moment now. Sarah's favorite thing tonight, maybe her favorite thing of the month, is she found a big fat book in this bookstore about how the corporations are ripping us off. It was a shock to her, but she's going home early and going to knock that off tonight. And we expect to have another volume like this in a year or something like that, and we'll all come back again. So Sarah, thank you for a life of work and service.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for, well, where did my little, this was our first little Bible. The loss of our family farms, inevitable results, or boom, 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 conscious policies. And I think that book that I bought, which I'm not as radical as I used to be. I actually mailed that book home so I can read it when I get home. I'm not going to read it tonight. I'm just, but I will read it. But it is the case. I mean, while the rest of us are out having fun, going to movies, this and that, and because I had worked in DC and New York City and Greenwich, Connecticut, at great big corporations, I saw how they all get together and they lay plans and they gather money and they plan things out. They absolutely do. And they've been planning. The thesis of this book that I've sent home, I'm sending home, is how they intend to take rights from the rest of us and give more rights and more powers to corporations. So, but anyway, never mind. But see, I've gone off on another segue. I really am sorry. But this was that theme, and Mark was the prophet. and thank you.
Well, and that, the guts of that came to me from four, as they were called themselves, almond farmers from Arbuckle, California, who were the national leaders and real drivers of the American agriculture movement.
Yeah.
So we were standing on the waves of the waves of the waves,
Yeah.
going forward.
Yeah.
And we were lucky.
Yeah, the nonpartisan league to me was like a religion growing up. It motivated everything. So we were, you know, it was when I saw that when the farmers, you know, I had to. I really didn't have a lot of choice. I had to do what I could do, and luckily I'd had this good education. And one of the things in the book I talk about is, you know, how stray things happen that have meaning and reverberate for so long. And when my last year in law school, we were asked to go do, they call them fair hearings for basically welfare women on aid to women with dependent children, and there had been a big effort to strip them of their benefits and so on. And somebody had brought a case called Goldberg versus Kelly, and the case established that the government could not take away the very means of survival of somebody who is on a government program without providing them with a fair hearing before a neutral hearing officer. So there I was in New York City, going up to the Bronx, and when I got off the subway, and this had burned into my mind, when I got off the subway and I'm walking down the street that looked like it had just gone through World War II, there was a woman sitting on a stoop, holding a little kid, all her belongings out on the sidewalk. And that she did not have a fair hearing. She was not allowed a neutral hearing officer, notice, opportunity to explain her situation, and that happened. So when I started working with the farmers, it took a little while for me to connect the dots that they were all white except for my Native American clients who didn't come across right away. And they were in North Dakota, and they were basically dealing with hundreds of thousands of dollars typically, or tens, but they were the same as that woman sitting on the stoop. They were being pushed out of their life, their livelihood, their home, without due process of law. So that was the two themes, and it was very important. That case is called Goldberg versus Kelly. Important.
So Sarah,
And the ACLU brought, the ACLU is the one, student ACLU group is the one, and then later on, the national ACLU came in, Bert Newborn, great lawyer. Yeah, Bert Newborn, Bert Newborn.
So Sarah, there was another part of this, which is you began rummaging around in case law from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and finding these unbelievable North Dakota laws.
Yeah.
Their own money in a lot of counties. Confiscatory prices were then used to stop foreclosures in a period. I mean, you found parts of the law, and that's why they got to really get your movie made, because this is fun stuff.
That was fun. The Confiscatory Phrase Law was passed in 1933 by the Nonpartisan League. They had control of the state government of North Dakota, and it basically said whenever prices of farm products were confiscatory, meaning you got less than what it cost you to produce, and somebody brought a case in court against a farmer, the judge did not have to approve the collection action, did not have to approve the foreclosure, and could just halt it. And it was a defense. And back then, the Bank of North Dakota was on a wrong trail, and the Bank of North Dakota had the right to do what they call foreclosure by advertisement. They would advertise the farm for sale, and then the farmer had to sue to stop it. And to stop it, you had to have a defense. And so we argued that the confiscatory phrase law was a defense. And the judge did not agree, but the Supreme Court of North Dakota did agree 5-zip.
What?
And after that, it slowed down so many foreclosures. It slowed them down, and we needed time. That's one of the things we
Yeah,
were looking
that's
for
right.
was time. We needed time because we needed reforms in Washington or other things. But yeah, North Dakota had a lot of cool laws. Unfortunately, like 2 decades later, they repealed it, but it could be adopted again. I just want to share that with all. Any state can do it. And back in the 30s, many states had even wilder and crazier things. One of them, I can't remember the state, they had a law saying that henceforth, the lowest priority on every court docket will be collection cases. And then they just languished.
And Sarah, there was a
fun.
lawyer in Georgia that was stopping foreclosures or trying to on houses in rural areas.
Yeah.
Miller
Martha Miller, and it was farms.
Farms, okay.
Yeah, and before that, there were other lawyers. She actually worked before that on homes, but she was a legal services lawyer and a real pioneer. I talked to her recently, and she's doing bankruptcies just great. She brought a case called Curry versus Block, which was like a big balloon that went up over the horizon, and everybody, or the sun was rising, you saw the Curry case. We all had hope. And Martha brought it with class action, and she had been with Georgia Legal Services. And I must admit, for decades I was jealous because I thought, gee, Martha's got a salary, she gets to work for legal services, but yeah, sure, but and I talked to her recently and I found out that legal services, because this is under Reagan, legal services had told her she couldn't do it, so she quit. She brought it as a private attorney, which I don't think any of us realized that, but that's what she did. And she had a wonderful judge, and he wrote a beautiful opinion, and it was a class action for Georgia, and then it was, and we thought in our naivete that because the judge had ordered USDA to change its regulations, and it's a national program with national regulations, we thought that Georgia case would protect everybody, but they beat it off. But I copied the Georgia case, and I started going through, there's other cases too where farmers were getting thrown out of, they couldn't go to court because they had not exhausted administrative remedies, which is a prerequisite pretty much to pursuing any federal agency. And so when I was exhausting administrative remedies, I got a really steep education on the problems and fallacies and cruelties and unconstitutionality of the way USDA was going about their hearings. And it was an educational process. And eventually I decided that I would bring a case like Martha's, but I would add all this constitutional stuff about how they were not being offered due process, the farmers. And then, so then that stopped the starve out, because the starve out was the government would just decide one day that we're going to shut these people down, and would offset their bank account, because you usually had a supervised bank account, and would not release any further money to them for any purpose, whether it was medical insurance or food for the family or food for the cattle. And then the choice was, you either quit, quit now, or we'll take your farm later. But in the meantime, they had nothing. And that was really harsh and very distressing. So as a category, my class was broke farmers who had, by definition, no money at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So For a long time, I was pretty well alone. There were not other lawyers, but we did do a lot of legal seminars and tried to bring other lawyers up to speed, and many did. But it was, so I wanted to write the book because I think, this farm depression is different. I mean, interest rates are lower, certain things are different. But on the other hand, there's extreme suffering out there. Prices are confiscatory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, almost every farmer does not make enough money to pay for the expenses that it takes them to produce the crop or livestock. And it can't go on. It's been papered over by massive amounts of federal money. But how long can farmers count on that? And farmers are aging and young people can't start. And so I really want to just sort of send up a balloon and say, be careful, watch out, things are happening, and be prepared. And also, if we could do it, if we could do these different things. And the flag too was, I got to shout out to.
Say who they are, say what flag is.
Okay, Farmers Legal Action Group, founded by a grant by Farm Aid in, 86? Something like that? And, yes, nonprofit law firm based here in the Twin Cities, and it's been doing work ever since, providing education material, going to court, doing all kinds of great things, and holding the light up for private practitioners all over the country. And that came, they did two more. When I finished the Coleman 1 case, I call it, which was ended in about 85 when they dropped the appeal, the government dropped the appeal, and theoretically when you drop an appeal and you lose, you're supposed to follow the court's order, but they amended the regulations to try to get out of it, and then Flag litigated Jim Massey and Randy, you were a law student, and we got to talk about the farm advocates, Luann Kling and people like that. They were, so, I mean, a lot did happen in Minnesota. It was good.
They lived out near that border though, I'm sure.
But, so I try to touch on a lot of that, and at the end of the book I say, give money to Flag, give money, give support, go to National Farmers Union and read the policy materials, and, because I think all of us need to step forward and support family farmers.
Could you talk a little bit about how government subsidies impact family farmers? Or do you talk about it in the book?
I don't. I really don't talk about the subsidy problem. Not problem, but I would rather Mark did that.
Well, there's a very short answer and quite a long answer, but there's like a little kind of a medium one, and let me try the medium one. The end result of all of that organizing in the 30s and the confiscatory stuff was that people woke up to the fact that there needed to be policies that maintain non-confiscatory prices, and those were put into place. And so we had those policies in place. In fact, some of them are still actually underlying law and have never been repealed, but they've been amended over. But anyhow, those laws were very successful in bringing the farm community, broadly defined, back to a place where they could pay their bills and they could retire and they pass the farm along. But there was a struggle that came after the Second World War, and that's what's in this little book. And that struggle was people saying, oh, that's socialism. and that's terrible. And we want to dominate world markets, and so we need to have cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper food. And many of these crops aren't really food, they're sort of fodder and they're for other purposes. But the policy battle that took place began to be one about making the prices go down, and the agreement that really changed the politics was that, hey, we'll push the prices down, but we'll send money from the US Treasury to make up the difference. And that policy went on for about 10 years, and we got into the Vietnam War and very expensive things, and people said, oh, we don't have enough money to send as much as needed. And so they said, you know, we could send less money, and farmers' land was escalating in price, and they can borrow against that land. And so suddenly you had an established low price, you had a bunch of money coming from the federal government, and you had a lot of debt coming out of banks going into land. And at one of the farm meetings where we assembled the
Yeah.
old timers from the
It's in the book.
teens and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, the then retired, probably 70-year-old, which I consider young now, editor of the Farmers Union newspaper, in his panel said something like, I see that farmland prices are starting to go down in northwest Iowa, you know, someplace. And those of us who were young, and I would say naive and somewhat uninformed, thought, oh, that's great. And he said, no, that's not great. What's gonna happen is that's gonna begin to unravel. Farmers will be foreclosed. Prices for everyone will start to go down, and the right wing will come in and exploit that. You take my word for it. This is what he said to us. And about 6 months later, we assembled in the basement of a bank in Nebraska and recognized that he was right, and that the right vigilantes, the posse comitatus, they were doing penny auctions and silver dollar sales. They had suicide hotlines. They had help. And his prediction, which is that the prices in the land falling would precipitate a big sell-off, because the banks had a law that said it didn't really matter if you weren't behind on your bills to the bank, but if your land or house fell below in value,
It's called an insecurity clause.
you're right, you were out of your house. And so that was the beginning of not only a period of sort of the right wing contending with, you know, what we were, populist organizers, but also bankers were being shot and people were committing suicide or blowing I mean, they've had all of the social aspects of that crisis. And so in the middle of that debate, the fight was over both a fair price and a system of fair price, and stopping these foreclosures and the dynamics of that foreclosures.
Yeah.
We didn't win all of these fights, but we won some very important ones, and we bought some time.
And one of the reasons I went into politics, I became an assistant attorney general and then the Ag Commissioner of North Dakota, was that I really believe that unless mainstream government did something that was helpful to all these people who are going through these very painful things, that it would become extremely ugly. And I did see a lot of pretty ugly stuff. But I'd like to tell about one. There was a guy who went through Minnesota, and he was arguing that farmers should shoot the bankster gangsters. That's what he said. And he had an armed militia camp, and he was well dressed, and he looked like a reasonable person, but he was absolutely filled with hate. So I was pretty naive then, and I decided I would go and heckle him. And so the secretary at the AG's office and I drove to Jamestown where they had this big meeting, and he was up in front, and I just resented the fact that this asshole had come into North Dakota and was trying to mislead people, and it just burned me. So I was telling, he was saying, do this, and I would stand up, that won't work, can't do that, won't work, bad idea. And I kept doing that, and I wouldn't sit down, and finally he got so upset that he rushed off the stage, and I've never seen a person with their mouth frothing. His mouth was frothing. But before that, he was actually grabbed by Tommy Kersey.
Oh my goodness.
Tommy Kersey was with him, and Tommy Kersey grabbed him and wrestled him out the door, and the meeting sort of broke up. But before that all happened, there were these two farmers who could see how mad this guy was getting, and they turned around and they said to me, these are farmers I knew, or they knew of me, and they looked at me and they said, don't you worry, Sarah, we'll protect you. So I felt confident after that, but I during those years, I really felt I had backing. The farmers were on my side, and I would go to their farms. I would talk to them and try to talk them out of these ill-believed, ill-conceived ideas about. They would sell this legal gibberish to farmers and say, if you do this, you do that, you can save your farm. And here's a kit that will only cost you $40, and follow this. And it was all just absolute exploitation. It was terrible. But a lot of stories about that.
Yeah, well, and there's still the same,
the same things going on today.
disinformation, and I mean, there's an aspect of this that's still going on. But I think one part of this that, thinking about the forces arrayed against farmers on the financial side, and the forces arrayed, kind of political, but we also had the experience of just knowing how dangerous it was to farm. Rolling over tractors, or being hit by a tree, or being hit, just, and so there was a combination of trying to understand that, at the same time trying to understand nature and ecology and how we're all connected to the land, the soil, the water. And so in the midst of this, when we had this old timers conference, so we gathered the organizers that we could find from the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s. I mean, these were some old people. But some of you know the Nearings, Scott and Helen Nearing.
Yeah.
You have to be kind of old to know them a little bit. But they would only come and speak if their name of their panel could be Sustainable Agriculture, the Quiet Revolution. That's how they wanted that wing of the movement to be described. And I think it was part of trying to understand the violence of the economic system alongside of the struggles and the challenges of, cold weather or heavy rain or drought or whatever, alongside of the limits of nature that, really Rachel Carson and others, including the Nearings, kicked off. And so all of these things were represented in a kind of progressive farm movement that Farm Aid helped to keep alive and just, and that Sarah writes about in the book. There's a book that has just come out about this phase of the movement in California, which wasn't heavily mixed in, but it's important. But that way meant that the farm movement that is captured beautifully in Sarah's book is a progressive farm movement, a progressive populist movement, a progressive people's movement, and it still is. And some sizes of it are even larger. What's happening in our indigenous farm, Minnesota has a Somali Minnesota Farmers Association, among Minnesota Farmers Association. I mean, there are other forces now, but it's still a very progressive farm movement, and now we have a little more oomph to help keep pushing it forward.
I've heard too that people at USDA are reading this.
What do you hope they learn, Sarah?
Well, I hope they realize the good parts that were set up by USDA. For example, the origin story of the Farmers Home Administration, which was the enemy during this book, was in the 30s, and it was set up by teams of people who went out and documented poverty. There were great Farm Security Administration photographs, were all so that America would understand, general America would understand the struggles that people, whether they were sharecroppers in the South or dirt farmers in North Dakota, that they understood the humans and their hopes and aspirations, and it was an amazing, it is an amazing organization, and they had social workers and business managers, and the whole idea was that they were going to help people and build them up, and very patient capital, very low cost loan for wait, and then you build your equity, and when you do better, you graduate. And the interesting thing is that through the 80s, those laws, those regulations really didn't change. They were still there, but the people who were running USDA had changed, and they wanted to get rid of the program, and they perverted they perverted it, and turned it into something that was not. And so, if the people at USDA who read this book, I think maybe they will say, "Oh, this is the history," because I tried to put the history. Rexford Tugwell, big hero of mine. He was the economist too, hard to believe. But they did some really good stuff, and if we look back and we can see the really good stuff that happened in the past and build on that, and then learn from the mistakes, and I would also like to see lots of reforms at the Department of Justice. I haven't really begun on that, but there's really something wrong, very, very wrong, with a government lawyer who believes their job is to defend the government as opposed to seek justice and do what is right. And if an agency is violating the law, they should not be defending that agent. They should be telling the people that are suing, "You're right, we're sorry. We'll change. Thanks for bringing this to our attention." So I think reforms have to happen at the Department of Justice, because there's something about how, because I just got out of, and I'm still traumatized by 19 years, I don't want to exaggerate with 20, 19 years and 9 months of litigation against USDA about discrimination against Native Americans. I'm not over that yet, because they defended that, and it was indefensible. When we filed that case, they should have said, "Wow, gee whiz, we're really sorry," and it would have saved the government hundreds of millions of dollars and lots of pain. And I'm still burned, because during the 19 years, 9 months, many people died without ever seeing justice, and had lost their land and their hopes and their dreams and so on. So I'm not over it. But that's a reform that has to happen at the Department of Justice, because when litigation starts, it also moves over to the Department of Justice, and the client, which in this case was USDA, back then it was David Stockman and Charles Schuman, and they loved what they were doing was shutting down farmers. They thought they were doing the right thing. But nowadays, you know, I think they're probably, if somebody were to sue USDA now, I think, with new leadership, would say, we wanna do the right thing. I just don't know that the apparatus at the Department of Justice is going to kick into litigation mode, or they're gonna kick into what's right, what's wrong analysis. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at too.
Other questions? Cause I know at some point.
Hi, I'm a native North Dakotan. I live
Oh.
here now, from Bismarck, but some of my family farms up in Ray, North Dakota.